So thank you, Helen, for giving me a really tricky... Actually, I volunteered, didn't I? I did volunteer the subject. On September the 11th, 2001, a date that I know will resonate with you, I was at home when the phone rang. On the other end was Philip, my dear friend and, at that time, vicar. Hilary, he said, put the television on. I did. And we sat, each in our own homes, phones to our ears, completely silent, watching as the events of those terrible moments unfolded. For the two of us, sitting separately but together, words were unthinkable, silence the only proper response. Archbishop Rowan Williams was in New York that morning. He recalls being in a meeting just a short distance away from the World Trade Center. And he remembers escaping in time from the building they were in. He says this: "It can't have been silent, but I remember it as quiet. The very few words spoken to each other, the ghostliness of it all." And the following morning, he was out on the street once again, and he was stopped by a young man, an airline pilot, a committed Christian, who asked him what he thought a supposedly loving, powerful God was doing when those planes hit the towers. Rowan remembers fumbling for answers to the question, trying to articulate something helpful, yet knowing in his heart it was just too soon. And that memory motivated him to write a very short book in response to those terrible events. He felt strongly that Christians should be able to say something rather than nothing in the face of suffering, whether that suffering is inflicted by human beings or the result of what we sometimes call natural disaster. So what do we say? Where is God in suffering? Well, the moment we do reach for words, we become mired in theological complexity. I find it easier to begin by saying what I really do not believe. I don't believe that God wills or inflicts suffering upon us. I don't believe that illness is ever a punishment from God. I don't believe that we can ignore suffering because it'll all be all right when we get to heaven. However, I do believe this. I do believe that God is always to be found in the hearts and the hands of those who respond to suffering with selflessness, courage, tenderness. I do believe that we have free will, and a logical consequence of this is that God will not remove our human agency. I do believe that we suffer because the world is not as God longs for it to be. And I do believe that suffering, like all human experience, changes us and shapes us and molds us. We can say some or all of those things in the face of suffering, but as Rowan Williams discovered, we can only say those things after a considerable time of silence. But none of what I have said is an adequate response to the question, where is God in suffering? The heart of the theological problem that we face has been noted by Christopher Southgate, scientist and theologian, who has wrestled for most of his working life with this. He says this: "The world that we observe and inhabit has predation, violence, and suffering deep within its structures, suffering which far predates the emergence of the human species. The same processes which give rise to beauty and diversity and ingenuity in creation also give rise to suffering and extinction. Human beings have free will to make loving choices or evil choices, to care for one another or hurt one another, and to cause specific ecological harm. But the actions of human beings do not account for the entire and general suffering of the non-human world. There is a real ambiguity at the very heart of creation, which we just know for ourselves. We experience beauty and joy and delight, but we also experience suffering and diminishment and decay. Our exploration of where God is in suffering takes us right to that heart of mystery, that place of mystery. And it's not a comfortable place to be, but we are not left there. There may have been constraints on the ways in which God created this fruitful world, but the Christian doctrine of incarnation asserts that God, the Creator, dwells deep with us in his own creation. And God will continue to dwell deep with us in that creation until that day we wait for with eager longing and expectation, when all suffering is removed and the groaning of creation ceases. When we pray, when we search for God in our suffering, it is a human face that we see. The face of the man who eats with the outcast, who welcomes the stranger, who heals the sick, who touches the untouchable. The face of the man who runs towards us with arms outstretched, ready to gather us up. The face of the man who hangs on the cross, taking everything, all the pain, the sorrow, the violence, the suffering of the world deep into himself. The face of the man who dies and really dies. The face of the man who is raised to life. The face of the man who can look at Mary and say, in words imagined by the author Francis Spufford, far more can be mended than you know. It's with the sound of that love song that we live now. Yes, we continue to suffer, and the world is filled with pain. But the world is also filled with joy and beauty and hope. Far more can be mended than you know. And we will never be alone, because God is love and he pours that love into us, continually enlarging our hearts and guiding our wills as we work with him, until that day when maybe we will understand the mystery at the heart of creation and understand something of the suffering that we bear but cannot grasp now. Rowan Williams called that little book Writing in the Dust. He called it that for two reasons. The first was the obvious reason. That morning when he stumbled out of the building on the 11th of September, the air was filled with dust and ash and grit. But the second reason he called it that, was to remind all of us of the value of silence. In the story of the woman caught in adultery, Jesus bends down to write in the dust. He does so to allow ourselves time to see ourselves as he sees us, loved and forgiven. to tune our heartbeats to his, to work with him in the renewal of this extraordinary world, to hold the silence so that we can hear the love song of our Creator, our Redeemer, and our friend. To know that because he is with us deep in our suffering, far more can be mended than we know. Amen.